Tony Conrad is geboren in 1940. Hij is in het dagelijks leven verbonden als docent video aan de Universiteit van Buffalo. Als componist en violist heeft hij naam gemaakt sinds begin jaren 60, vooral in wat heette, en daarover straks meer, The Dream Syndicate. Dagelijks oefent Conrad op zijn viool. Doet hij dat niet, dan kost het maanden om weer op het oude niveau te geraken. In een orkest kan Conrad niet spelen, in een klein ensemble of een dweilorkestje al evenmin. Wat Tony Conrad vooral doet, is het spelen van toonladders. Langzaam en zo zuiver mogelijk. En dat al bijna een leven lang. Toen Conrad nog klein was, waren er andere bedoelingen. Maar ook zijn docent, de gerenommeerde orkestviolist Ronald Knudsen, zag wel in dat het niet zou worden. Tony Conrad.
Oh, I took violin lessons when I was a boy. I took violin lessons for a long time, and my teacher found that I didn't do very well. This was maybe in part because I wasn't very expressive. And in part because I didn't practice. No, I didn't want to work. In fact, give a violin to a boy, and what's he going to do with it? It sounds awful to begin with. It doesn't make music in any coherent sense of the word. And so, yeah, then what? Well, you know, I couldn't get into it. And the pieces also that I was assigned to play, like a little serenade, or, you know, the minuet by Boccherini, or, you know, these kind of pieces, or, I mean, God knows what, a kind of just saccharine, romantic little pages, you know. Anyway, it wasn't working. It wasn't working, and my violin teacher finally recognized this and found that I would be much more interested in learning about why sound worked. So he bought me a book on acoustics, and we spent my time with my violin lessons going over the book on acoustics. I don't know if my parents knew that that's what was happening. And then he said, well, you know, if you want to know about this, you should just play scales and play them very carefully in tune. And then he got me the Bach chorales, bought me a book of Bach chorales, and said, just play the top two parts, you know. You play them together. And I found that if I played them, as he said, very, very carefully in tune, violin sounded much better. And then I didn't like to play with vibrato. I could never play with vibrato, so I never did. And that was part of the problem. I think vibrato covers up a lot of the trouble. So then he suggested to me that if I played very slowly, that he said, if you can play something slowly, you can play it fast, so don't worry. So he always would encourage me to play slowly and in tune. Basically, that's what I do. I've just learned to do it in a slightly different way. And so I can't play the traditional way. You know, like I can't play in an orchestra or, you know, or for that matter, in a fiddler band. But that's not what I wanted to do.
Outside the Dream Syndicate, Tony Conrad with Faust. Zo heet de cd waarvan deze opname die we nu horen afkomstig is. Het gaat hier om een samenwerking tussen Tony Conrad en de Duitse krautrockband Faust, die begin jaren 70 deze opname maakte en die in de jaren 90 op cd werd uitgebracht. Ze deed dat in een boerderij, even buiten Hamburg, in Wümme, een boerderij die Faust toen zomaar ter beschikking had via een platenmaatschappij. Op kosten van die platenmaatschappij was de deel van de boerderij verbouwd tot opnamestudio. In het andere gedeelte woonde de band. Het gaat hier om een sterk staaltje Duits-Amerikanische Freundschaft tussen feitelijk een ongeschoolde hippieband van jonge kunstenaars en een Amerikaanse violist met een achtergrond in de modern gecomponeerde muziek, Tony Conrad, die op dat moment vooral in de weer was met experimentele film.
It was a farmhouse with where the back building had been converted into a sound studio. Very nice to have their own sound studio and a house to live in. So it wasn't a farm at all, really. I was lucky to be in Germany at that time, traveling, because my friend Lamont Young had hired me to work on a piece that he had installed that summer at Documenta in Kassel, and I spent some time there. I spent some time in Berlin and visiting friends, and I spent some time showing my films, and at that time I had a package of films that I traveled around and showed. And so I flew to Hamburg and spent several days working on this project with Faust. I had some communication from their producer, Uwe Nedelbeck, and he had sent me some of their records. And so I had an idea that he was interested in producing sound that had some of the qualities of a classical music experimental tradition, but was really pointed to a pop market.
Tony Conrad noemde hem daarnet al even, zijn vriend Lamont Young, de Amerikaanse componist voor wie hij werkte op de toen 5e Documenta in Kassel. Ze deden trouwens toen ook nog een optreden tijdens de Olympische Spelen in München. Met diezelfde Lamont Young zat Tony Conrad in de groep The Dream Syndicate, waarvan de ondertitel later luidde The Theater of Eternal Music. Behalve Tony Conrad en Lamont Young speelden in die groep ook John Cale, later van de Velvet Underground, en Marion Cezila, dat is de vrouw van Lamont Young, en ook nog de inmiddels overleden Angus MacLeese. Dat alles begin jaren 60 in New York, tijd van Fluxus ook. De Dream Syndicate speelde uren, dagen, weken, maanden achter elkaar hun monotone muziek. Ze oefenden bijna onafgebroken en waren ambitieus. Er moest gebroken worden met tradities, muziek moest opnieuw worden uitgevonden en geluid, meer dan muziek, was de leidraad.
The idea of the group that we had been established in the early 60s was to live inside of the sound, so to speak. That is to exchange the position of the composer for a different role in which the sound began to be a plastic presence, almost a sculptural object. The idea of going inside the space of the sound and inhabiting that space, and then working with it as a live thing in a performance mode, so to speak, and thereby shifting the terms of improvisation, shifting the terms of the composer, shifting all of these terms and trying to come up with something completely new.
Er moest dus in The Dream Syndicate radicaal nieuwe muziek gemaakt worden. En dat zou alleen maar kunnen door te breken met de traditionele rol van de componist. De basis nu voor die rol ziet Tony Conrad al gelegd tijdens de hoofdse Europese cultuur. Specifiek tijdens het bewind van de zonnekoning Lodewijk XIV in Frankrijk. Toen namelijk, zo betoogt Tony Conrad, kwam de componist min of meer gelijk te staan aan de commandant in het leger. Met een orkest dat precies had te doen wat de componist beveelde. En met een muziekcultuur ook, die een uitdrukking werd van aristocratische belangen. Voor Tony Conrad zijn dat inzichten van de laatste jaren. Begin jaren 60, met The Dream Syndicate, waren er andere motieven in het spel om te willen breken met de rol van de componist.
In the early 60s, the ideas were coming from a somewhat different direction. Those were times when the ideas that we had were more essentialist. They were more based in thinking about music in and of itself and culture in and of itself. And there was a lot of symbolic activity at that time. A lot of ideas that by writing an important piece, you could change the history of music, for example. The people who were involved were people who had been very close to Fluxus and who had been actively pursuing a radical tradition in musical contemporary music culture for some time already, and were we hurt by these traditions? I don't know, and no more than other people are hurt by them. But some of us believed that there were somehow paradoxes and difficulties in the way that culture was represented, and only in recent years has my more systematic research pointed more clearly to some of the problems that are there. The Western music is very powerful, but it's important to understand that it grew in an environment which was almost exclusively devoted to the aristocracy and to the service of the courts of Europe, and then in the 19th century, there was a shift as the audience became commercial, but there was a bourgeois audience that was a little unsure. The Romantic period is a problematic outgrowth, but fundamentally the politics of the Western composer tradition comes from the court orchestra of Lully. Under Louis XIV in France, and the Sun King, and the idea that the orchestra could be like an army, that it could be organized to play exactly what the composer wrote. Because before that they didn't. They played some extra notes. They didn't start playing all together. The string players played with their bow going any which way, and Lully turned all of that around and turned it into a disciplined force, which was the same that was happening to the European army. At that time, in the 17th century, the European army achieved a kind of discipline that, in the 30 Years' War, in which it learned how to conquer the world. So why not conquer the world through music too? So the residue of this tradition isn't always understood or recognized, but it's there. It's a part of that tradition, and I feel uncomfortable today with the militarism of the United States, and I feel that the idea of the composer as inherently a commander who inscribes military rules that must then be sent to the forces and dictate a pattern of action. That seems inappropriate. That's not a good way to make music.
Sinds een jaar of 10 is er sprake van een herontdekking van Tony Conrad. Een belangrijke rol daarbij is weggelegd voor de muzikanten Jim O'Rourke en David Grubbs. Die hadden in de jaren 90 samen de band Castro del Sol en zij zijn het die Tony Conrad hernieuwd onder de aandacht brachten. Via het label Table of the Elements uit Chicago kwam er ook nieuwe muziek uit van Tony Conrad. Hij werd zo behouden voor de vergetelheid en ineens kon ook de naam Tony Conrad worden toegevoegd aan de lijst pioniers die ooit de toon zetten voor minimal music. Maar ook al speelde hij vrijwel in anonimiteit, jarenlang, helemaal gestopt met muziek, was Tony Conrad nooit.
I stepped aside from the development of the tradition of minimal music at a certain point because I began working with film. And I found that it was very interesting to find myself a filmmaker, in part because I could work with sound in relation to image. It's a very powerful and interesting place to find sound, and that kept me going until my interest in film began to be dominated by problems of art. And then I turned back to music again. I spent a lot of time in the 70s and 80s playing the piano and working out new ideas about a kind of a different understanding of musical materials that I think is a little closer to the postmodern ideas that some other people were evolving around that same time. But then I decided that there were interesting qualities of the relationship I had to the introduction of the minimal tradition that I should revisit and deal with in the way that in a way that would bring the historical record back into music and fit music into the social and historical register that would be proper for it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Een beetje cryptisch had Tony Conrad het daarnet over zijn vierdelige cd-serie Early Minimalism, verschenen in de jaren 90, die voor hem de terugkeer inluidde naar muziek van zijn hand, die ook daadwerkelijk wordt uitgegeven. Daar ging het een en ander aan vooraf. Zo kwam er vanaf midden jaren 80 brede erkenning voor de minimal music. Vooral dan via de meer toegankelijke muziek van Philip Glass en Steve Reich. Daarna, in de jaren 90, kwam er ook meer aandacht voor andere pioniers op dat gebied. Voor The Dream Syndicate, voor Lamont Young, voor Rhys Chatham, voor Charlemagne Palestine en ook voor Tony Conrad. Dat alles via muzikanten van toen, als Jim O'Rourke. Platen werden heruitgegeven op cd, nieuwe werden opgenomen. Wat niet het daglicht zag, waren de opnamen van de Dream Syndicate zelf. Want de honderden uren die de groep opnam, begin jaren 60, lagen op de plank bij Lamont Young. Diezelfde Lamont Young nu peinsde er niet over om de muziek van de Dream Syndicate vrij te geven. Tony Conrad en ook John Cale hebben daarover hoog oplopende ruzies gemaakt, al was het maar omdat het ook hun muziek is, zo betoogde zij. Ze mochten er echter niet bij. En daar zat dus Tony Conrad met alleen maar herinneringen aan de muziek die hij zelf toen heeft gespeeld en zo intens heeft beleefd. Conrad besloot toen het alsnog zelf maar te doen. Hij nam de serie Early Minimalism op.
Well, then I made this series of works called Early Minimalism that were based on a problem I had in accessing the early recordings we had made because they had been suppressed. So I decided that it would be interesting to go back to that space and explore a kind of resurrection of the sound, but not in a literal or dogmatic way, but in a way that could be understood more loosely. and maybe as a kind of simulacrum of that early music, of that earlier minimal music. Calling a piece early minimalism, of course, doesn't make it early minimalism. There's no such thing as early minimalism. When we were making early minimal music, it wasn't even called early or minimal. That only gets assigned later when the historian enters the picture. So it's an ironic title, and it's and the pieces are not a recreation of any kind, but they're intended to try to play with the historical condition that had resulted by that time, by the 80s, in a firm entrenchment of the minimal music idea within the larger culture of music, through maybe not so much Lamont Young and Marian Zazila and myself and John Cale, maybe because our energies were more, I think, more radical than the work of Phil Glass and Steve Reich, who worked in a more traditional way with rhythms and orchestration and career building. Yeah, so that their influence had spread, I think, the idea of minimal music into the dominant culture. Then something interesting happened in the 90s, which was that young people coming out of the rock tradition crossed paths with some of these sounds. That had started actually much earlier with Sonic Youth, and in fact with Glenn Branca, and even earlier with Rhys Chatham, who I think was the first person to make minimal guitar music in New York in the early 70s.
Zijn opnames, zoals te horen op die vierdelige cd-box Early Minimalism van Tony Conrad. De muziek die we nu horen betreft zijn reconstructie van juni 1965. Hoe meer er over Tony Conrad werd geschreven, sinds een jaar of 10 geleden, hoe vaker het ook ging over de opnames van de Dream Syndicate. Dat betekent ook dat het steeds vaker ging over muziek van revolutionair belang. Over opnames ook van de grootste betekenis. Over muziek die de koers en het aanzien van de moderne muziek zou hebben veranderd. Dat idee tenminste leefde er. En met niemand die die muziek kan horen, wordt zo'n idee alleen maar groter. De Dream Syndicate, ook wel de Theater of Eternal Music, kreeg zo een mythische reputatie toebedeeld, zonder dat iemand een noot had gehoord. Inmiddels is die stilte doorbroken. Via het vaste label, Table of the Elements, zijn er 3 cd's verschenen op naam van John Cale met de toepasselijke titel Inside the Dream Syndicate. Met daarop dan toch opnames van de oorspronkelijke Dream Syndicate, begin jaren 60. Misschien spreekt het ook wel voor zich dat het uiteindelijk eenmaal naar buiten gebracht, na lang wachten, alleen maar tegen kon vallen.
I don't know, because when we finally were able to release one, people said, "What? Oh, that doesn't sound very good." We were recording these things on usually in monaural, on equipment, on quarter track, reel-to-reel tapes back in the early '60s, and some of it isn't up to today's standards of sound reproduction. So some people are disappointed, just as they might be disappointed by when they listen to old 78 recordings. I mean, I think it's fabulous. I think it sounds wonderful. The music sounds wonderful, and I think that it was really quite important to define something about what really had been going on, because by that time, a lot of people were talking about this and wondering, sort of like, well, was this something that was just made up, or or was it? Was there anything there? What was the there that was there? And this then importantly defined that to some degree. It was very interesting to me to stand at a point where I could look back 20 years and see an image of what I had been doing at that time, 20 years earlier, that was formed through the residue in the culture. That is, that I could see all of the influences. I could see the development of a sound that had, in some sense, flowed through people like Rhys Chatham, who's now living in Paris, I think, and then from him through Glenn Branca and Sonic Youth, and so there was one view of this that was very indirect, but very big, like a big picture. And there was another view that, so to speak, inhabited my hands and lived in my head, and was a part of my. What can I say? If you play music of a particular kind, especially very, very narrowly, just a few notes. You play just a few notes for 3 or 4 years, it'll live with you forever. And that was in your head, and in your and then in your body, how you can move your body. So the performance was there, and it was in my head. And on the other hand, at the same time, it's in the culture. This fascinated me, that there was a private and a public identity to this, and neither of them was grounded at that time in any real object, because no one could hear the original sounds. So very mysterious state of affairs.
De opnames van The Dream Syndicate, hoe hij daar niet bij mocht en waarom wij het niet mochten horen. Een tijd lang leek dat het verhaal van Tony Conrad's artistieke leven te worden. Dat is schijn. Conrad had genoeg om handen en pionierde voort met video.
Well, I was very invested in film, and then I started to work in video. I teach video now at the university in Buffalo, and so a lot of the things that flowed out of my life moved into media and into that. That's been a good vehicle for me too. And I still enjoy that crossover between sound and working in video.
Het werk met video aan de Universiteit van Buffalo heeft er niet toe geleid dat Tony Conrad live ook optreedt met beeldvertoning. Gewoontjes is een presentatie ook niet. Tony Conrad treedt op al jarenlang achter een strak gespannen wit doorschijnend doek, zodat we hem als silhouet zijn elektrische viool zien bespelen. Dat er geen video aan te pas komt, heeft voor Conrad heldere redenen. Het ene werk aan de universiteit moet niet overlopen in het andere op het concertpodium.
There's something peculiar about the art market. And I think the most peculiar thing is the way that a person becomes a brand name for their own work. And that happens in some measure in the music business too. But I've never been committed to that. I've always felt that for me, it's always been a good thing to earn a living some other way and not to be dependent on my cultural production for my living because then I can question it to the degree that I want to. So being non-commercial positions you in differently from, I think, what happens to most artists. I don't have to stay in one place. I can move more freely from one area to another. And one thing I like about video is or about working with, the movie video kind of image way of working. That it's a form that includes everything. It includes, you have pictures of things, you have sound, you have image. Everything goes in there, and I think that's one of the reasons that it completely fascinates people. So I've been very happy to be able to move flexibly across those lines.
Eerder dit jaar, in maart, trad Tony Conrad op in zaal België te Hasselt tijdens het jaarlijkse Kraakfestival. Dat is vernoemd naar de gelijknamige muziekuitgeverij. Hij is de oudste muzikant die optreedt en hij staat als laatste geprogrammeerd om 11:30 's avonds. Conrad staat op een festival met een uitgesproken, deels radicale programmering. Maar zo extreem als zijn set is er niet één ander. Het repeterende spel op de viool gaat maar door en beproeft het publiek op ongehoorde wijze.
I like to play loud, yeah. It's I've always enjoyed the combinations of the pitches that I hear very close to the instrument. And when I found that I could amplify my violin and have those sounds available, not just when you're close, but also, I think the difference tones that are the result of two pitches playing together they were first described by a violinist, Tartini, in the 18th century, I think. And that's not surprising because I'm sure they were known to violin players for a long time. You put this box up next to your ear and you make a big racket with it on two notes and you hear other notes. You just hear these other notes that are produced by the combination of the two notes loudly together. And until it was possible to amplify instruments, the audience couldn't really hear that so well. You can hear it if you go and listen to bells. If you listen close up to bells, or if you listen to flutes close up, you can hear it, or trumpets. Yeah. But the sound of the amplified string is really nice that way. Yeah, so that's really one of the nicest things about playing loud. And since I started amplifying my violin, then of course it's turned out that rock musicians have sort of they've upped the ante, as you would say in a poker game. They have increased the level of sound enormously at times, so I mean, even now, I mean, even when people say, oh, I play that, when people complain that I play too loud, I go to rock concerts and they play much louder than I do. So yeah, so I don't know if I really play that loud, all in all, but by using a certain particular set of pitches, it does seem to be louder too.